Okay.
I'm saying we're living in crazy times, if Shimon. What?
Yeah. Do you want to take the machine off for a second? So the question that I'd like to answer today, in a somewhat much deeper way than normal, is a fundamental question. We all realize in our life and so on that we can't see God. God is not visible. But why isn't he visible? That's the question. Well, he's not visible not only to us, but he's not visible to the spiritual world either. No malach and no neshama can see God. God is not subject to visibility. And the question is, why not? Why isn't there some way to see God? The only thing that we can't even see the spheres technically. You know, the only sphere that we're connected to is the sphere of the Shekhinah, which is a sphere of Malchus. But all we can see is the spheres. We never see God, and so on. So therefore, it seems to me God is fundamentally completely invisible. And the question is, why not? Well, the simple answer is because, first of all, God is not composed of anything. God is not what's called a composite entity. He's not a being which is composed of different different parts, like the human body or a malach's body. So therefore, since God is not composed of anything, we can't see him. God is beyond concept. So therefore, God is fundamentally invisible to the human mind. The mind can only grasp concepts that it can conceive of. Anything which is beyond the concept is invisible. We have no idea what something is if it's beyond the concept. And first of all, the Ein Sof, which is not really God. The Ein Sof is not God, but the Ein Sof is called by the title Ein Sof. There is no end. And what that means, it's not referring to physicality, where he's infinite in being and he's everywhere. This has nothing to do with God, because God is beyond space. He has nothing to do. God does not have a location at all. He has no location, and God is not even contained within certain parameters. God has no boundary. So therefore, God has no substance. So since God has no substance, it's impossible at all to be cognizant of him at all. So the only thing we're visible of, really, in a certain sense, the Ein Sof is visible in the sense that it's considered Ritzono, it's considered his will. So in a certain way, we experience the existence of the Ein Sof as the active force that did everything. But in a sense, in a basic sense, the Ein Sof is simply Ritzono, the will of God. But God himself has no will. Why? Because the ultimate truth of God is Einod Milvado. There is nothing else but him, or Einod, nothing. What does that mean? It doesn't mean that there's nothing else, that happens to be the circumstance. It's not a circumstance that there is nothing besides God. It's an impossibility for there to be anything which is like God. So therefore, God is completely invisible. But more than that, God himself is called Atzmusoi, is beyond Ratzon. God has no will. Because if God is everything, then what does he want? You only want something that you can't have or that you don't have. But you have no need for anything, and you're not dependent on anything because you have no will. So therefore, you have no will. You have no desire for anything. So therefore, why did God create the Zulasoi in the first place? It sounds like he wanted to do something, and they say that's partially true. God is a Tov. He has goodness, and therefore he's a Meitiv. He wants to do good, and that's his Ratzon. the will of God is manifest as the Tov, as a maker. But God has no will. Why? Because the Zulaso doesn't exist besides God. The true meaning of Ein Od Milvado is that God has no outside. That's right. There's no such thing as something outside of God. Ein Od Milvado means there is nothing but Him. It really means there is no outside to God. So since God has no outside, there is nothing else in existence. The only thing that actually can exist, or rather be manifest, is God Himself. And how He's manifest is completely unknown. Completely unknown to us. We can never know, we can never relate to that. So besides the fact that God has no will, God has no substance, God is not in time or space or in anything, God is completely outside the realm, so that there is no reality outside of God. There is no entity outside of Him. So therefore, what is God? God is His quality. God is His wisdom, is His strength, is His power. He and His power and His intelligence and His strength and all these things are identical to Him. He is those things. We have never seen anything like this. All of us possess qualities, and these qualities are outside of us. In the sense they're inside of us, but they look like they're outside. It's visible to us, to anyone looking at a person, where he can see intelligence, or he can see wisdom, and so on. But God has no qualities which are outside of Him. He is identical to all His qualities, and the nature of that being is completely unknown. So that fundamentally is the reason why God is completely invisible. God is not subject to any kind of detection, because God is not a part of reality at all. Reality was created with the creation of the world. With the creation of the Zulasoi, God created a reality which in a certain sense, to some extent, encompasses Zulasoi. But God Himself is completely outside of reality, because there is no reality to God. There's only the fact that God has no outside. So that's one way of looking at it. But the truth of the matter is, there's another way to look at it, which tells us something very deep, which usually escapes us. And I'd like to talk about the other reason why God is invisible. You see, there's another reason why God is invisible, which has to do with the very gift that God gave mankind. And therefore God is invisible and will always be invisible. He will never be detectable, period. Why? So for this we have to examine the nature of knowledge. How do we know something? So we say that the way we know something, we have sense perception. In other words, we have certain types of organs or something like that, or some kind of mechanism which detects something from the outside. How does it detect? Like the eyes. The eyes is a sensory organ, and the eyes detect something because it receives the light waves that bounce off all objects that we see. But this detection is something which sees an object as outside of himself. And how does the eyes form an impression of what we're looking at? It forms an image. It's called an image. It's like a camera in certain ways. The eyes detect the image of an object by being sensitive to light that emanates from the object. The ears are also a sense organ, and it detects vibrations which indicate sound signals coming from an object. So therefore, all our senses really form some kind of image in our mind. And that image clearly indicates the existence of an outside. So with the knowledge of all entities which are outside of us come from our senses. And the senses produce an image of it and so on, and that's how we know that it is. But how do we know that we exist? We know that everything exists. We see everything, or we either see it through our own senses, or we see it through advanced senses, like, for example, a microscope or a telescope or other things, different metric systems which can measure the existence of something else. But how do we know that we exist? We can see the existence of everything else through some kind of sense perception. But how do I know what's called the me, the one who's seeing all these things, the one who's actually having the sense perception? So the answer is, it's not through a sense. It's through the process called self-awareness. And what exactly is self-awareness? Self-awareness means that the figure who's fundamentally having the awareness, his awareness of himself tells him that he exists. That's right. He knows that he is because his awareness, which is produced from the sense of self, the Zulasa is actually nothing more than a being of self. What that is in actuality, we don't know. It's a pure self. And what this self does, what it actively does all the time, it participates in the process called awareness. And the awareness of the self tells the self that he exists. So therefore we see a very profound concept. Existence is nothing more than a product of awareness. There's no such thing as existence itself. Existence as a product of awareness is the way we know that we are. And where does this come from? Well, in a certain sense, this is an intrinsic knowledge. You see, the sense of self-awareness is completely different than the detection of every other entity in the world. All other entities we know, we were able to become knowledgeable of because of what? Because of the sense itself produces an image of whatever that entity is. Either it produces an image in itself, or it could see or could know the sense of self through certain instruments and so on. But we have certain senses that detect entities in reality by forming images of these entities and putting the knowledge of this on our mind. But where is the knowledge that I am, the knowledge of me, where is it placed? Well, it's not placed anywhere. It's produced by the sense of consciousness or the sense of self that we all possess. Every human being, every Zulaso possesses a self which is involved in the process called awareness, and it's that awareness that tells the self that he exists. So therefore we see that the way we know ourselves is totally different than when we know everything else. We know everything else by a detection of reality. It's called a sense perception, which is some kind of image of that entity in reality. But the sense of self that knows itself, that's called awareness. And that's a completely internal, intrinsic process. Where is this awareness? Well, it's synonymous with consciousness. And where is this consciousness? Well, it's produced by the sense of self, for itself, by itself. In other words, the amazing thing about a human being, which is the fundamental Zulasa, is that he knows that he is through himself, by himself, with himself. So therefore, the element which gives him self-awareness is called the itself. We don't really have a clear definition of the itself, but the itself is the fundamental essence of the human being. It's the essence of human being which gives him the sense of me, of the word me. But at the same time, when it gives the Zulasa the sense of himself, the word me, it sees everything else outside of himself. In other words, the human being has something which no other creature has. In fact, this thing that is a gift from God, and nothing in reality possesses this gift except a human being. And what is that? That gift is the itself. The itself. A person knows that he is by itself. He is a knowledge of himself. You can say in a certain way, what is a person? A person is nothing more than the act of knowing oneself. That's it. What is the structure of the self? We don't know. We don't know what the self even is like. But we know it seems to be a certain entity that has the capacity to know that it exists by itself, through himself, for himself. And that knowledge is not from a normal sense perception. When we know ourselves, it's not through a sense perception. We just know in a certain way that we are central to all existence. All reality exists outside of ourselves, outside of the me. And we suspect that the me, that the person himself, is part of reality. But that's not how he senses himself. In certain ways, he senses himself as above and beyond reality. His knowledge of himself transcends the process of reality or even existence itself. So therefore, it has an inward quality, a certain inward quality where his sense of self is actually identical to the knowledge of himself. So therefore, it's like he carries his own existence by himself. It's like a backpack where the fact that he exists is perceived by the entity called self. And this is a certain internal knowledge. It's not like a sense perception, which is the knowledge of something outside of you, usually requiring a sense organ of some type. But the sense of self itself allows you to know yourself by yourself. And that quality is called the itself. That's the quality, that's the entity quality where the person says me. But since the person can say me, therefore everything else in reality is a you. So therefore there's a fundamental duality that emanates from self-awareness. The concept of me, the itself, which knows itself, that it exists, and the concept of that which is outside of the self. And we call that you. So therefore there's a fundamental duality of me and you. So therefore, the sense of self-awareness is an intrinsic form of knowledge, whereas all other knowledge is contained because it's extrinsic. So we see every entity in reality, whether it's a physical entity or a spiritual entity, we see that as an object. And there's a very big difference between the physical information we receive and the spiritual information. When we see another person, we sense the complete physicality of the other person. We see the object in a physical form. And when we are souls, we see the other object as a spiritual form called a soul. So these are all entities in the reality. The reality is physical, subject to physical sensation, or it's spiritual, subject to spiritual sensation. But the bottom line is that knowledge is about something else, something outside of it, which is the you, whereas yourself, which is intrinsic to the sense of self itself, is what's called me. So therefore, self-awareness is a form of knowledge which is completely different than other awareness. And this is a very critical thing. We normally don't consider that as duality. But the fact of the matter is, when I am self-aware, when I know me, I am the center, I am the one who observes every other object in reality. And somehow that knowledge is what is said to be intrinsic, whereas the knowledge of all objects in reality is extrinsic. So that's the fundamental difference between this. And this is the gift from God. Why? Because the only being that knows itself by itself, it has in itself, which is identical to itself. And it knows that it is. And who is that? That's God. In other words, God knows that he is and that he is God. He has a knowledge. But the difference between his knowledge of himself and our knowledge of ourselves as human beings, or as an angel or anything, is that his knowledge of himself is identical to himself. It's the same thing. We cannot distinguish between him and his knowledge. They are both the same thing, beyond concept, beyond substance, beyond sense perception. Whereas we know that we are to a certain medium, and that medium is the self. And we have a certain sense of ourselves as separate from ourselves, because we say the words, I know myself. Well, what's the difference between the word I and the word myself? Well, even though it indicates that I am myself, but there's still a duality there. The I, in referring to the self, and myself refers to the self, indicates some form of duality. So even though the sense of yourself, the sense that you exist, is absolutely true and one with yourself, there's a slight separation between the two. Your awareness of yourself is somewhat outside of your sense of self. Can we detect that? No. The self-awareness that we have that sponsors the word me is so merged with the sense of self, we cannot tell the difference. For all practical purposes, it's like it's equal to the sense of self itself. But there's a slight duality, and that's how we speak. That's how the language speaks. Because the language says, I know myself. There's two words that refer to the me, the I and myself, which indicate there's some form of duality in our self-knowledge. But even though that's some form of duality, that duality almost disappears. You see it. Why? Because I know myself from myself through an internal, intrinsic awareness, whereas I know everything else through a sense perception, through an organ that provides sense perception, which creates a model or an image of the entity and then gives it to my mind. But the itself which exists in the mind is completely intrinsic. And this quality is a quasi-divine reality. What do I mean? The angels, when they first saw Adam Rishon, they thought he was God. And then they discovered later, a short while or right then and there, that he wasn't God. Well, why would the angels think that Adam Rishon is God? What characteristic does Adam Rishon have that suddenly would validate the fact that he may be God? The fact that when the angels saw Adam, they saw his sense of self was actually separate from everything out there. That's right. There's something about the self which not only sees itself by itself, it sees itself as separate from every other entity. So it sees God the same way. From your sense of self, you have a certain centrality, a certain central feeling about yourself, where you are outside of and separate from everything else. So therefore, when the person sees God, he sees God as outside of him, just like he sees himself as outside of God. He cannot stop this. Since his sense of self is completely independent of everything else, he sees himself as outside of God. And this is a very big problem. Where does this quality come from? This quality comes from God himself. Because God is the ultimate being who knows himself by himself. You cannot create something. God could not have created a self-awareness outside of himself. Why? Because that which is outside of God is not him. And the fact is, God has no outside. So therefore, how do we consider that God made the Zulasai? How did he do it? So what I tend to think is God did not create the sense of self. God did not create the Zulasai. It's shocking. The Zulosai was never created, it was derived. D-E-R-I-V-E-D, derived. In some way which we cannot understand, God derived from himself the Zulosai. So therefore, the Zulosai has a certain quality which is almost like God. And this quality is called the Tselem Elokim. Man is called a Tselem Elokim, the image of God. How is he the image of God? He's the image of God because he has the ability to see every entity outside of himself. And he can't help it. That's what he sees. Because he sees himself as the center of all reality. So if he's the center of all reality, reality therefore must be detected. And it's detected through either an inward sense or an outward sense. But it has to be detected. And the fact is that the Zulosai sees God the same way. He cannot see God in any other way. He sees God as outside of himself because he sees his own existence within himself. So therefore God, which is an entity according to what he sees, must be outside of him. And the ability to see his own existence as a center which detects everything else in reality, that quality is quasi-divine. It's similar, it's like, but not equal to, but it's like the ability of God to know himself as outside, even not only of everything, but outside of even an outside. So God's sense of self is much more intense than our sense of self. Because even when we see ourselves by ourselves, we have a sense of our own centrality. But that's different from God's. God's sense of centrality is so intense, it's so great, that he does not see the possibility of an outside. So he has a sense of self which must include everything and anything. He is synonymous with a sense of self, with a sense of his ability to say me. When God says me, it's a me that has no outside. It's a me that has no possibility of a you. So in a simple way, we can say the difference between us and God is that God says me in a way, but without reference to a you. There is no you because there's no outside. But when we say me, we do include the possibility of a you. But since we are similar to God, since we are a Tselem, we are in the image of God. When the angel saw that other Mauritian had this kind of intrinsic self-awareness, he thought that maybe he was God, but it realized that he's not, because the angels even saw that he has a certain duality, that other Mauritian, the first man, saw the angels as a you. So if you see not only yourself, but you see everything else as a you, that means that you are not God, because you have an outside. But God, who does not see anything outside of him, cannot say the word you. So therefore, to create such a being and so on is to create something not from nothing, because you cannot really create that, but you can derive it from yourself in some extraordinarily powerful way, which we can have no understanding. So the sense of self-awareness is quasi-divine. There is nothing that possesses that sense of awareness. So even though animals have a certain sense of self, because we see that they fear death, they fear their own extinction. So therefore they fear the extinction of their sense of self. So we see that an animal, let's say like a cat, has a sense of himself. But the difference is that the sense of self of an animal, if he has it, is actually outside of him. It's in reality. Reality supports a sense of self for the animal. But a human being has a sense of self which is completely internal. It doesn't exist in reality. It's a separate event. So the human sense of himself is completely, in a certain way, outside of reality, or almost outside of reality. So for all practical purposes, the human being does not have a sense of self. But this is from God. This is what makes you human. And what's going to do? If you have a sense of self which perceives everything outside of you, so then what is the greatness of that? Because that sense of self, since it's completely independent of reality, and it sees itself separated from God, separated from reality, it possesses free will. It can possess free will. Because what do we mean by free will? Free will means free from who? What does it mean, free will? That your will is free. What you want or what you choose is completely free. Who is it free from? And the answer is from God. Now, how is this possible? We do not understand this. We cannot grasp that meaning. But what God says, I have given you free will, and therefore you are free from me. That's right. What are you free from? You're not free in terms of your existence, because I had to derive you to make you. But you are free in your choice. And the one choice that I want you to have is what? What does God want from us all? God wants us to go inside. He wants us to go inside of ourselves and derive Himself to derive our knowledge of God. What? That we are inside of. God is inside of us. The reality is that we are not outside of God, because God has no outside. But because we have free will, and God allowed us to be manifest, and because we can actually choose who God is in reference to ourselves, by ourselves, we have the free will to make that choice. And God says, you have to make that choice and not me. Because even though you are not outside of me, because I derived you, but you have the perception of yourself as if you were outside of me. But you have to correct that. Well, why do we have to correct that? If our sense of self-awareness says that God is outside of the sense of self, even if it's not true, because it isn't. God has no outside. But since that defines me, that's the way I know the me. The way I know me tells me that there is something outside of me, and that's part of my nature. That gift was given to me from God Himself. So why can I be allowed to possess the quality which is His gift? So the answer is because that quality gives you a possible false conclusion about my relation to you. Since you only see things which are outside of you, you think therefore that, God, I'm outside of you. But if you think that, we have a very big problem. Because the truth of the matter is, when I have derived you for the specific purpose of having you coexist with me for eternity. That's right. God says, you are really beyond time and beyond space. You are really nothing more than a product of my self-awareness invested in you. But your self-awareness is the one based on the duality, where you think that I'm outside of you, and that's all right. But you cannot be invested in the falsity of that idea. Even though your perception will always see me as outside and you as outside of me, you cannot invest yourself, you cannot invest your truth in the fact that I am outside of you, because the truth is I am not outside of you. And if you think I'm outside of you, you will therefore have a very strange feeling. Your feeling that you're outside of me contradicts what I want to do with you. And what do I want to do with you? I want to coexist with you. I want to coexist with you, and you should know that I'm not outside of you. I'm really inside of you. Because if you think that I'm outside of you, you will reject the goodness that I prepared for you. Because if you think you're separate from me and you're outside of me and you're independent of me, you will say to me, fundamentally feel like, wait a minute, since God is outside and I'm not dependent on Him, and I possess a quality which is somewhat similar to God, called a Him, therefore I don't want to be connected to Him. My sense of self demands that I remain independent of God. My sense of self demands that I believe that God is outside of me. And therefore, I will reject Olam Haba, because the essence of the future world in the future is that I know that I depend on God, and I know this and I accept it with my full reality. But if I feel through my perception, to my self-awareness, that I am outside of God, then I will reject the possibility of being with Him in Olam Haba, because I don't need God to exist, because I feel like I'm already outside of Him. And God says, no, I have created you, to coexist with me, and you can only coexist with me if you know yourself as attached to me. You have to realize that you are not outside of me and that you can attach to me and are always attached to me. And that knowledge will give you a certain joy and a simcha, which is Olam Haba, beyond time and space. But if you reject that possibility, if you want to believe that I am outside of you because your sense of self tells you I'm outside, you will reject by offer my tov that I want to give you. So therefore, God was faced in a certain sense, Kaviyachol, with a certain dilemma. He wanted to make you the greatest being that was ever made. He derived you and gave you the gift where you actually see yourself as outside of Him. Nothing sees itself as outside of God, except the human being. And that's what gives the human being the capacity for free will. So God says, that capacity of free will which I have given you as a gift that makes you somewhat similar to me, like David HaMelech says, you are slightly less than God, is a gift that I have given you so that you can appreciate who I am, that my being is inside of you. You cannot exist without my being. I am the source of existence for everything that is, including you. But if you believe that you're not attached to me, that you're actually outside of me, that is false. So even though that's the reality of your sense of awareness, that's not the truth. And therefore you will reject the tov that I want to give you, that you will remain attached to me forever, beyond time. So therefore God said, and that's called Nam Sufa, the desire to detach from me because you believe that you're outside of me, which is the gift that I gave you to make you somewhat like me. But that gift will undermine what? What I want to do for you, to give you the greatest tov of all, is to be attached to me and to realize our closeness, that I am inside you, I am not outside you. So this is very powerful. So therefore man was created and he was given a task to realize that God is inside of him, that God is not a duality. There's no such thing as me and you. There's no such thing as me and you. There's only simply me and enemy, which is God. Please silence your awareness, your internet. So this is the ultimate contradiction that God has to face. And that's why he says to him, in order for you to understand and to realize and to become aware of the truth that I am inside you, you have to go even further inside, because your self-awareness is already an intrinsic act. It's already an act which is attached to your sense of self. So in order to become aware of me, that I am totally inside you, you have to go even more inside. In other words, I'm saying something very, very deep. That I have to become part of your sense, God says, I have to become part of your sense of awareness of self. That's right. Because you are not outside of me and you are derived from me. So therefore, your awareness of me is not as a you, as if I'm outside, but it's of yourself. You know me because you know yourself. And this is what's very critical. So God said you have to arrive at that truth by yourself, not through me. You have to be your own cause. I cannot be your cause at all, because you have free will and you have to be your own cause. So therefore, I'm going to give you a mitzvah. I'm going to do two things. I'm going to create a world, which is the illusion that I'm outside of you, and that's called the physical world. So you will think that I am outside of you like every other object. And number two, not only will you have that, you see, you have that, you will have to choose that even though this is what you see, this is not what is. So you have to make a choice between what is and what appears to be. What appears to be to you is that I'm outside of you. What is that I'm not outside of you because you're not outside of me. So therefore you have to make the choice between the truth of who God is and his relation to you and the truth that you think that you're in reality where everything is outside of you. Unless if you do not absorb that truth, you will not be able to coexist with me forever. This is the deepest concept of all. So what do we see? We see a very important fact, that God is invisible not only because he's not subject to sight, not only because he's outside of light and outside of the physical universe, not only because he's outside of the spheres, because he's outside of everything and not composed of anything as far as we know. But in addition, you have to realize that your perception is not true. The only perception that you have, which is true, is that I am inside of you, not outside. And you must come to this knowledge by yourself. So therefore, I'm going to make a physical universe which tells you that your outside is everything, that everything is outside of you except the me. Everything is you, except your own knowledge of yourself, which you claim to be me. And how do I do that? By creating a physical universe, by giving you a guf, giving you a physical body, where your knowledge of everything comes from outside of you as an image, not inside of you. The only thing that will come from inside of you is your own awareness of self. But I am also part of your self-awareness because I am an even deeper level part of your self-awareness. You are not only aware of yourself by yourself, but your awareness of me exists into a deeper level of itself. And you have the capacity to become aware of me when you become aware of the self inside the self, another level, deeper level of your own self-awareness. That's where I exist. I exist not outside of you as an object. I exist inside of you as a certain inner me. And you must achieve the understanding of what that truth is. And therefore, I will create a physical universe, which is a false universe, which will let you believe that everything's outside of you. But I will give you a mitzvah, a commandment that you should do something or not to do something. And by doing this, you will develop a sense of love. The main concept of the mitzvah is to allow the possibility for you to love me. Why? Because true love is attached to something which is part of yourself. When you love something, what does that mean? That means that you see something as actually part of yourself. You do not see it as outside. When a man loves a woman in a real way, in the most intense way, he sees that person as part of himself. He does not see that person as outside of himself. And that's not an easy thing to achieve. So God says, since I am part of you, since I am the inner core of you, you have the capacity to love me. So therefore, I'm going to give you commandments. And when you do the commandments, you are declaring on my truth that I have no outside, and simply I am part of you. So suddenly, by acknowledging that I have no outside and I'm the inner me of you, you will gradually become attached to me, and that's Olam Haba. So therefore, this is called the Vekas. The Vekas is a state where you love God. Why? Because you see God not as a you, as outside of you. You see God as an inner me. Now, this cannot be normally obtained in a physical sense, and even in the spiritual sense, it's not obtained. Because everything in the physical and spiritual universe sees other things as entities outside of them, even though to some lesser degrees. Physical beings see everything as definitely outside. Spiritual beings, like angels and souls, see each other slightly outside, but they still see everything as outside. But in Olam Haba, which is the eternal universe, God says to you, you will see me from the inside. In other words, you will see me what? You will see me not by seeing something, an entity, which you see through your sense perception. You will see because you will become knowledgeable of that which is under your deepest core. You will feel me from the inside. And therefore you will realize that I am part of you. I am not outside of you at all, because I have no outside. And that's called Dveikus. So therefore, Olam Haba is the most intense form of Dveikus we can have to God, to the Rebbeinu Shalom. Because suddenly we see God from the inside, from the same place that we see our own sense of self-awareness, from the inside. But it's much greater. Because once you sense God from the inside, which is the way we will sense God from what? In Olam Haba, we have supreme feeling of love and a supreme sense of joy and ecstasy. Because the perception of God from the inside leads to the greatest sense of oneself. Not only the sense of the itself, but the sense of God behind the itself. And this is the greatest sense of joy that's possible, because suddenly you will connect to the core of your being in totality. Olam Haba is simply the place where you attach to God from the core of your being, the very inside of your being. To the one who made you, the one who is God. And that will leave you with a tremendous sense of ecstasy and joy. But you cannot do this unless you accept the fact that I am not outside of you. I am not a duality. We have no such thing as me and you. As far as you are concerned, you can say me, but you cannot refer to me as a you, even though that's your perception. But that's not your truth. And you must achieve this truth on your own. And this is called the Tikkun of Nam Sufa. So the function of Olam Haba is to give us the greatest sense of truth that there is. And that is what? That is, God is our inner core. And we cannot fully feel this until Olam Haba, when God eliminates the physical universe and eliminates the spiritual universe. And all that's left is God himself. And that's what every Zulase will feel from his inner core.
Shimon, the statement that you can't see God
excuse me.
True.
Let me finish. Ask your question at the end. So now we understand something. What is the whole purpose of the mitzvahs? The purpose of the mitzvahs is to allow us to suddenly become in touch with God as he exists in us. Not God as he exists outside of us, because God is not outside of us, but to touch God, to become aware of God as he exists inside our core. And in Olam Haba, we will finally be able to detect God from the inner core of who we are. And that's Olam Haba. It's the ultimate Dveikus. There's only a minimal form of Dveikus that we can achieve while we are physical or while we are spiritual. But the maximum level of Dveikus, or attachment to God, is the complete perception of him as our inner core. And this will only be in Olam Haba. So what do we see from all of this? We see that fundamentally there are two types of knowledge. There's the knowledge of something which is outside of you, and that's done by sense perception. And then there's the knowledge of something which is inside of you, and that's the way we know ourselves, through self-awareness. But even more than that, the knowledge of something inside you goes down to an even deeper level. And what is that? That's not only the knowledge of yourself through self-awareness, but that's ultimately the knowledge of your inner awareness, your inner sense of being, your core, and that's God himself. So therefore, there are two forms of knowledge, what's called extrinsic knowledge, through what? Through the belief in reality and the awareness of reality, and that's what's called inner knowledge. That's the knowledge of who we are from the inside of ourselves, for our own sense of self, and it includes especially the knowledge of the existence of God as He exists in our inner core. So this explains to some extent the Nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu, it said, gave us the Torah, but in order to give us the Torah, he had to acquire the knowledge of the entire Torah and the mitzvahs. From where? From God. God gave him the Torah. Torah is divinely inspired. Well, but where did Moshe Rabbeinu receive this information? What is the nature of his prophecy? Moshe Rabbeinu had a different prophecy than all other prophets. All the other prophets, before they had a prophetic image, they had to suddenly go into a tardema called a trance. And that trance was something beyond life but before death. They were in between life and death. They weren't quite totally alive because they were in a trance. They couldn't move and they weren't conscious. And they were also aware of what? Of the spheres and everything spiritual. And from this relationship of what? Of seeing God in a trance, they were able to see the structure of the spheres and they knew what God will do in the future. But Moshe Rabbeinu had a completely different form of knowledge, a different form of prophecy. When he prophesied, Moshe Rabbeinu never went into a trance. He was totally conscious. But how's that possible? How could you be suddenly conscious? How could you be suddenly aware of God without being in a trance? Well, because the answer is Moshe Rabbeinu knew God from the inside. All other prophets knew God from the outside because they saw God in terms of the spheres and something like an object. They related to God as an object, giving them information. But Moshe Rabbeinu related to God as his inner core. Moshe Rabbeinu withdrew into himself, into his inner core. No one else has ever been able to do that except Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu, in a certain sense, replicated a minimal form of Olam Haba. That's right. The reason why Moshe Rabbeinu had a prophetic ability to know God consciously, in total awareness, is because he accessed the existence of God from his inside. He was able to go down into his inside and suddenly become aware of God, who then transmitted to him the knowledge of all the mitzvahs and the knowledge of the Torah. So therefore we see that Moshe Rabbeinu was not even human. In fact, they see Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe Rabbeinu was half man and half God in the sense that his knowledge of God was intrinsic, from his core. He prophesied from his communication with God in his core. All other prophets prophesied outside of their core. So that's why Moshe Rabbeinu had to approach the Madrega, the ability to be in Olam Haba partially. Moshe Rabbeinu, to some extent, experienced what it would be like to be in Olam Haba greater than any human being that has ever lived. That's right. The greatness of Moshe Rabbeinu in his prophetic ability was that he knew God from the inside, similar to the way we will know God in Olam Haba. And no other human being ever existed that could do that. And that was the greatness of Moshe Rabbeinu. So therefore we see something extremely powerful, that what God wants us to do in life is to do the mitzvahs. Why? So that we will see God as our inner core. That's right. And develop the sense of dveikus. We will choose to do the mitzvahs to develop a sense of dveikus to the Baruch and a sense of love. And from that inner love, we will sense him in our core, not from the outside, even though our fundamental sense of God will always be from the outside to some extent. And we see this from what Chazal say about Olam Haba. Tzadikim Yoshrim. Tzadikim are sitting, which means they are static. And their crown is on their head. And what is their crown? Well, that's the sphere of Kessin. And that's the thing which puts God outside. That's right. When you know God through the spheres, in a certain sense, it's not the total knowledge of God through your core. But that's who we are. We will always know God through our sense of self-awareness, which is the gift of God himself. And from that, we derive our duality, which is our ultimate simcha. So we see that we will never leave this gift that God gave us, that we see ourselves almost separated from him. And no other being in existence sees that. But at the same time, that gift, which makes us similar to him, almost like God, that gift also confuses us to the truth that we think that God is outside of us, that God is not. God is in our inner core. And the ability to identify with our inner core and know God through the inside of your self-awareness only will be truly given in Olam Haba. And that is the gift of ultimate Devekis, a Devekis which never ceases and gives us a sense of ecstasy and joy which is incomprehensible. But that's what Olam Haba is. But we have to earn that. Not earn that, we have to remove the ability of believing that God is outside of us, because that's false. But that's a fallacy which God himself gave us. God, in order to make us so great and to make us in his image, had to give us a gift which almost, in a sense, convinces us that we don't need God. So the gift that he gave us is the very thing that makes him invisible. So therefore we will never see God. Why? Because we will only know ourselves fundamentally through a process of self-perception, which is somewhat outside. We see ourselves somewhat in a duality. And because we see ourselves somewhat in duality, we will never be able to see God, because God does not exist as a duality at all. God exists as an internal truth, which we must develop to a sense of what? Of free will. So God, that's why God created the physical universe, to allow us to become even closer to him and develop a knowledge of him through Devekis, which is a sense of God and our love for God from the inside, not from the outside. So this is a very high thing, and the only one who ever really achieved this somewhat, to some level, is Moshe Rabbeinu. Because that's why Moshe Rabbeinu did not have to go into a trance when he prophesied. He was, like God says, he knew me face to face. It's like he's talking to me face to face. And it's only when you are in touch with your inner core, you talk to God face to face. Not when you see God as outside of you, when you see him as an object, but when you see yourself as part of his being, his subject. You join, in a certain sense, a certain aspect where you become part of the subject of God. And therefore we are the greatest thing which God ever made, and he gave us the greatest gift, which is a gift which is somewhat similar to him. And we have to correct that gift, because that gift creates the fallacy that he is the duality, and he is outside of us. The very gift that he gave us, the very gift that makes us a tzelem, the very gift that makes us like God, also gives us the false impression that he's also outside. Because when we see ourselves as what? As separate from God, as outside of him, we are seeing something which is false. But that's the only way we can see something. That's the only way we can really know anything outside of us. So therefore, it is up to our free will, by doing the mitzvahs, to obtain a state of Devekis, and to connect them from the inside, not from the outside. Okay, that's it. Are there any questions?
It's interesting that, it seems like the other Nevi'im and Moshe are completely qualitatively different. It's like calling both of them Nevi'im is sort of a misnomer.
Well, in a certain sense, that's true, but in a certain sense, that's not true. Because the truth of the matter is, and it's going to be difficult to understand, who is greater? Moshe Rabbeinu in his perception of God through Nevuah by seeing God from the inside, or Adam Rishon koydem achet, before the sin. Who is greater?
Huh. Oh, wow.
That's a tough question.
Yeah. It doesn't sound
Who
like
is greater?
Adam was. Doesn't seem like Adam was accessing his inner self like Moshe was. Sounds like he was relating to God as an outside.
So I
And
believe that
Moshe
the
sounds
answer is the
greater.
following. Who sounds greater?
Moshe sounds greater.
Adam Rishon before he sinned, or Moshe Rabbeinu was the greatest Navi of all?
Well, Adam wasn't a Navi in that sense.
Well, why wasn't he a Navi? God spoke to him, says, Vayom Hashem Adam. God spoke to Adam Rishon. And it says God spoke to Moshe. So what tells you that Adam Rishon, when God spoke to Adam Rishon, was greater than when God spoke to Moshe? If both of them are from the inner core.
Huh.
Not an easy question to answer.
No, not at,
so
not at
Yitzchak,
all.
do you have an answer? Is Yitzchak still on?
Huh. He might have fallen off.
Hello? Is Yitzchak still on the line?
It seems not.
Seems not. Okay, I'll answer your question. Adam Rishon was greater because Adam Rishon was before death. In other words, there was no Zom in the world before he committed a sin. Therefore, his soul and his body were equal concepts for the intensity of Adam Rishon. Adam Rishon was not a Navi. He was not a Navi because there was no Nevuah before Adam Rishon Koydem Achet. Why? Because there was no death. There was nothing that separated the body and the soul. So therefore, Adam Rishon was almost completely in contact with the soul, which is really almost completely being in contact with God. So Adam Rishon didn't have a need to be a Navi. A Navi is someone who's in touch with God. But Adam Rishon was not simply in touch. He was able to sense God from his inside because his soul was never separated from God. So he was never the object of Zorma, the evil, the darkness that pervaded his body after the sin. So therefore, his intrinsic concept in his essence was deeper, the deepest of all human beings, because Adam Rishon before the sin was not human. And because he was not human, he was not subject to the possibility of prophecy. He automatically was like the angels already. That's how high he was, so on. But Moshe Rabbeinu was in the world after death was decreed. So Moshe Rabbeinu simply had to access God through Nevuah. Moshe Rabbeinu had to access God through the process called Nevuah. And that's the process where you have to avoid death and try and access God as deep as you can. But death is always an impediment. It's always an impediment to your ability to contact God. So therefore, prophecy is a lower form of contact than a direct form. Adam Rishon was only one step away from Olam Haba, only one step away. In fact, that first Shabbos that he should have had if he didn't sin should have become Olam Haba itself. So therefore, Adam Rishon Koydem Achet was the greatest person, the greatest human being that was ever made. And only after he sinned, the death and the death suddenly enveloped the world and became the dominant force in the world. So the answer is Adam Rishon was greater before the sin because there was no Zoma, there was no separation of body and soul. So he was able to connect to his soul on a much deeper level. His soul was much deeper in his body than our soul is now. Now our soul has to separate from the body. But by Adam Rishon, before the sin, before there was death in the world, his soul was totally connected to his body. There was no separation at all. So So he did not require the gift of prophecy to connect to a soul on the inner level and thereby connect to God. He was automatically connected to God. Okay.
Right. I see.
So that's the shir for today.
Moshe was still part of the institution of Nevi'us.
Right. That's right. Okay, thank you for listening.
Do you have time for one more question?
Inform all the other people that I gave this year, and they should. This year will go into the Dropbox,
all right,
and so on, and they can listen from there. This is a very deep share, by the way.
Do you have time for one more quick question?
What's that?
Or should I ask you? So, if the source of our free will is this perception of outside, so the solution is to abandon free will, I guess.
The solution what?
The solution is to abandon free will.
Well, the free will will be taken away. Because once we choose the truth itself and we become completely connected to God, we don't have free will anymore. Because in our attachment to God, free will cannot exist.
Uh-huh.
So there will be no free will in Olam Haba. Because there's no duality in our perception of God from the reality of God. Once the reality of God becomes clear and we realize we are completely dependent on God and we are not outside of God, so suddenly there's no possibility of free will. Free will only exists when there's a possibility of making a mistake, where we see two different realities and we don't know which one dominates. That's when free will is applicable for us to choose. But once we establish the truth and we realize that God is inside of us, not outside of us, and we are connected to that inside in our inner core, free will no longer exists. Okay. Thank you very much.